of doing the hypothesis and a tentative outline structure, say 8 to 10 chapters, is the utter simplicity of it. You can capture a really very large idea, and indeed a large project, 80 to 100,000 words, in something that's utterly simple. And for me, whenever you're sketching out a large creative project like this, simplicity is a great virtue. And in fact, it's a great virtue in most forms of organization, which is not to say it's simplicity versus complexity, but a simplicity that accommodates complexity, that accommodates detail. The point of trying to get you to think in these very difficult, abstract ways, trying to get you to structure something, even as you're feeling your way into it, is to make it possible for you to see where the detail is going to go. That's what's really interesting for me. My friends in anthropology say that throughout all of human cultures, throughout the entire history of literature, there are only really 7 basic stories. You know, for the hero of the story goes out and returns. That's a common, simple story. And it doesn't matter whether it's Ulysses or a novel that was written last month, or it's about sin and redemption, something like that. These are basic, simple templates. So we're thinking now in simple template terms, but I'm trying to give you a framework, or to get you to think about frameworks that will accommodate all the richness that you research and uncover. Okay. We're going to do what I call classic dissertation approaches, which is thematic approaches and case study approaches. Despite the title, they're not rigidly separate. They're identifiable, but sometimes you have a mix or a hybrid of both. But by highlighting them as something quite distinct, it opens out to you the number of ways that you can think about exploring your theme. You start with a theme or a research area, and most of you have hundreds of possibilities, well, at least dozens. If I wanted to use one of my earlier examples, if I wanted to look at a contention, let's go with a hypothesis, I could contend that the impetus to regulate rather than restrict social media legally is making it easier for providers to outrun our legal systems because they're much faster than our legal deliberative systems. So the argument would be we need to restrict some forms of social media rather than to try to regulate them or ask the social media companies to do self-regulation. It's a contention. It's a hypothesis. But there are lots of ways you can do that thematically and via case studies. I mean, you could, if you want to take a case study approach, you could look at Google, Facebook, and Amazon, or Google, Facebook, and Snapchat, say, something like that. Or you could do it thematically. You could look at the difficulty of trying to regulate by legal means something that's very, very fast moving. So you could have a legal focus. So it could be the deliberative speed of the legal system versus the productive speed of the internet companies. You could look at political interests. You could look at business interests. So there's a powerful business lobby. There's a powerful political interest, plural, involved, and there's also the slow speed of the legal system versus the high speed of the internet companies. Those are 3 themes. So you see right away, even on that simple idea, there are lots of ways you could investigate that hypothesis, rough as it is. I mean, it's just a quick idea. So don't shy away from the richness of all your possibilities at the beginning. I know it's bewildering. You know, too much choice is a bad thing in human affairs. But don't rush to closure.
give yourself a generous allowance to think about the number of ways you can go about this. Let's see if we can make this work. Okay. And it's going to depend on your hypothesis and what kinds of evidence you need to substantiate. Remember, once you've got a hypothesis, or even as you're working on it, you're looking at something that you need to use legal language, prove beyond a reasonable doubt. You have to make a case. And whatever case you're making, what kinds of evidence would make your case? Would a number of individual instances, say particular countries or particular companies or particular services that companies provide, would that help you with your theme? Or have you got a particular case study? You want to look at, you want to examine whether online shopping is actually destroying retail trade. How are you going to do that? I mean, you could look at Amazon and a number of other companies. Or you could look at consumer behavior. You could do preferences. You could do it statistically. You could confine it to South Africa. You could do it comparatively, South Africa, the United States, and say the Netherlands or something like that, or Japan. Contrasting case studies. You see, any theme that you give me, and we'll work on this in the interactive sessions we're going to be doing from tomorrow. Remember, 3 interactive sessions, Wednesday, Thursday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday at 11. It's exactly the sort of thing we'll be doing. I'll say, come on, give me your idea. Let's see. And the group, each individual group, will pitch in their idea. Had you thought about doing it this way or that? You won't go away with the answer, but you'll go away with a feeling of the kind of creative thought that's required to do this. That's why I want to get hold of you in smaller groups. Okay? Okay. So we're going to do a bit of a recap on this Iraqi sanctions. So you remember, this is the framework for thinking. It's not a blueprint for doing the dissertation. It doesn't have to be 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, 4 in the top triangle, then the hypothesis, then the data and the analysis. It won't be, however you write it, however you tell your story, it's still systematically going to be like that. When you go to the theatre, the stage is dressed before the drama happens. The actors don't come out onto their stage and then halfway through they put the props up. You know, once you actually begin thinking systematically, framing an argument and having an idea of how you're going to unpack this argument, it's not going to be a million miles off of that. As I said before, none of my dissertations have an hourglass shape. None of the ones I've seen through, and I've done loads. I've lost count of how many I've supervised. But all of them found a useful way of thinking. So that's the first thing. All right. Okay, the Iraqi sanctions example from this morning. Yes, it's a single case, but it also has 3 themes. It's a perfect example of the way a case can actually be opened out thematically. Do you remember? I mean, she came to Iraq as a case study because it was the first instance in history where sanctions were actually, in physical terms, quite effective. But they didn't have the effect that everyone expected. And this thinking had gone on for a century. Okay. And then she took the case, Iraq, and she ran it through a rubric that she created. This is her contribution to knowledge, really. Explaining why it didn't work. And her creative step was to say, I've read the literature and I can see embedded in there, not explicit, but embedded, hidden, implicit, that there were 3 assumptions, and they didn't work. And of course she's left with a lot to do in her conclusions, at the end of the bottom triangle. What does this mean for the future of sanctions? Is the Iraqi case an anomaly? Is it one-off? We don't have any way of telling, but we can speculate. Or as my mentor once said to me, if you write 8 to 10 good solid chapters, then you can say any foolish thing you like at the end. Okay, so there's the hypothesis again. You can see this, right? Okay. Now, in some ways, this is a bit of a cheat. If this was the precise wording of her hypothesis, she didn't actually do this right away. She was confident, and rightly in my view, that she could get a hypothesis. And it's only once she uncovered, 6 months in, 8 months in, these 3 themes that she was able to do this. That's okay. Sometimes you have to keep your nerve. That's one of the things your supervisor is good for. So there it is again. Isn't that neat? Isn't that simple and elegant? What for me is the neatest part about that, the neatest thing about it, if I can find my pointer, I don't know about the pointer. The neatest thing about it is that the bottom of that top triangle, where it comes to a point, she's got a rationale. She's made the case. Remember my Supreme Court example? Yeah, all right, there's a case to answer. I know I'm giving you an example that's crystal clear. It's very nice. In some ways, it's almost too easy. Not that she had an easy time, but the point, of course, is to help you to understand the nature of the thinking. This is creative thought. Really nice, isn't it? So, let's suppose that you have a theme but no hypothesis, and that's where nearly all of us start. I honestly can't recall looking at a doctoral application that ever had a fully worked out hypothesis. I make judgments on acceptance based on background and interesting field. You know, is this rich with possibilities? Is this something I could actually supervise? And also, is it something where a hypothesis could be developed? The answer is yes. If it's yes, we'll take you on. And it's a good way, it says, of starting is to ask whether you'd like to concentrate on a case. And remember, a case study is always a case of what? Case is just a synonym for example. A case study is an example of something. And so that pushes you back to your hypothesis. I know, I mean, if you've done professional work in, Durban's urban planning department, or if you've got field work doing development with women's cooperatives, or you've got some other kind of professional experience, so you've been a health systems manager or something like that, you're at a big advantage, but don't let your professional experience narrow you down so far. If you're, again, to use the example, you've been for the last 3 years a health manager in Durban's hospitals, you've got to think carefully about what kind of problem you want to deal with. And you don't have to concentrate on Durban. Indeed, you don't have to concentrate on hospitals. You know, from that kind of experience, you could talk instead about health financing. You know, you can do whatever you want, so long as your supervisor doesn't freak out. And something I said earlier to one of you, it's really important right at the beginning is to ask yourself, where's your heart? Yes, I know you're all intellectuals and you're all big brains and all the rest of it, but you've got hearts as well. Remember, you have to live with this topic for 3 years. Don't choose something that bores you. You know, it's the best PhD students, and frankly the ones who are most fun to work with, are people who've got passion for what they're doing. They're really intellectually curious, and they've got a good sense that they're after something. There's a case to be answered, and once they've articulated that case, you stay out of the way, because they're hungry. They're investigators. Imagine reading a detective novel, a crime novel in which there is no crime. You know, most crime novels start with a murder for obvious reasons, because the detective, the character, needs something to investigate. The investigative. All right. So a case on its own won't pass the so what test. In UK universities, and I think in US ones as well, there used to be no word limit on dissertations. And now it's, throughout the world, it's generally 80 to 100,000 words. I have to say, any damn fool could write a dissertation of 250,000 words. Anybody can go out there and hoover up everything there is to know about subject X. So what? So what? I heard a tale, it may be apocryphal. Someone in the humanities wrote a 300,000 word dissertation on Canadian ambulance drivers of the First World War. He had no hypothesis. He knew everything there was to know about him. So what? Okay. Now, but it's fair to ask, doesn't the Iraqi sanctions example contain both a case study and theme? Not exactly. Not exactly. Cases are usually empirical and observable phenomena. Hyperinflation, for those of you doing commerce and business, it can be the problems involved in various kinds of entrepreneurship. It can be about private capital investment. It can be about supply chains, hyperinflation, morbidity and mortality trends, a UN peacekeeping mission, the development of Kenya's constitution. You can tell what sort of things I've supervised, can't you? States' political initiatives to end violence in the DRC, the effectiveness of certain, is something, it's specific, it's out there, empirical. Whereas themes are usually abstractions. In the Iraqi case, psychological logic, economic logic, and political logic. That's an abstraction. Legality and legitimacy, cost, time, quality, cost effectiveness, sustainability, that kind of thing. You do know that triad, don't you? About cost, time, quality? Anybody here have an engineering background? Whenever engineering manufacturing is set a task, you know, we're going to manufacture watches, or we're going to manufacture cars, or we're going to manufacture washing machines. They've got to get a balance between three things in order to be profitable, you business students. And that's the tension between cost, time, and quality. If you choose two of them, time, cost, and quality, you've already chosen the third. Right? So if you want to do it quickly, and you want to do it at low cost, I can almost guarantee it's going to be pretty low quality. If you want high quality, it's going to take you a lot of time. And hence the cost per unit will go up. It's quite an interesting sort of tension. And if you were doing something in manufacturing or something in engineering or some aspect of commerce, that triad is a really neat thematic triad. So you could state the problem in the upper triangle, you know, and then you could run the case, the manufacturer of washing machines or whatever you like, and run it through time, cost, quality. I'm speaking very crudely here, but you see how you could have a case and themes. It's not necessarily a choice between one or another. I'm going to give you an example from my own experience about the use of themes versus case studies. It's a variation on what I've just showed you. I had a very, very bright PhD student. She'd come out of the very top end of the US system. And this is the early to mid-90s, and it was a hot topic back then, which was peacekeeping and peace building. And her concern, and the concern of the international community at that time, was, okay, once we've stopped the violence, once you get a peace agreement, how do you address issues of justice? Because every time there's violent conflict, all kinds of atrocities take place, and people naturally want justice. And sometimes, in fact, often, they go back to war because their claims on justice aren't satisfied. So a big, meaty, interesting problem, and lots of cases. There have been violent conflicts in UN peacekeeping missions all over the planet. There were 2 dozen examples. Great, she said. You know, I'm going to do it based on case studies. I said, I thought about doing it thematically. No, case studies. Okay. So a couple of weeks later, she said, I'm thinking of doing 3 case studies. I'm going to just spread them out geographically. One in Europe, Bosnia, one in Latin America, probably Colombia, Guatemala, and one in Africa. Okay. I just thought about doing it thematically because they've all got differences and they don't cover the full range of post-conflict difficulty. Yeah, but I think I'll do it. A few weeks later, after a few more supervisions, she said, can I have 5 case studies? And I said, no, you can't do that. Your dissertation will be a mess. That bottom triangle will be like that. What am I going to do? I said, I just thought about doing it thematically. And eventually she did. And for her, the revelation came when she and this is again an act of synthesis. She read and read and read. And she was trying to get the structure right, trying to move from a broad idea to a structure. She discerned in the reading that 3 themes kept coming up. One was re-establishing the rule of law. One was what she called retributive justice, that is, punishment for perpetrators of crimes. And the other was distributive justice, that is, the things that make people go to war, no access to land and all that sort of stuff. So rule of law, distributive justice, and retributive justice. And then suddenly it all opened out in front of her because she had an utterly simple structure into which she could put all that detail. She suddenly realized that against those themes, she could illustrate it with all the cases at her disposal. For example, in El Salvador, for example, retributive justice, in Bosnia, for example, in Namibia. So she was able, without the dissertation getting messy at all, able to embed all that rich detail, but in a structure that was brilliantly simple. And that was a real triumph. But you will triumph too. Not necessarily quite in that way, but you'll see how themes and case studies can complement each other. And confession time, I greatly favor thematic studies. Because they do, in that bottom triangle, they keep things very, very neat. You know, so cost, time, quality, rule of law, distributive justice, retributive justice, whatever you like. They allow you to tell what's essentially a simple story with as much detail as you can imagine. It's a nice tale, isn't it? So do think about it in that way. Okay. You got any questions so far? You can bring up your own case if you like. No? Okay. Okay. Cases most often resemble themes when a dissertation concerns when you want to demonstrate different qualities, their scale, intensity, effectiveness of the same phenomenon. This is another student I had briefly, and she unfortunately she was assigned to another supervisor who didn't quite appreciate what she had. This woman, stunning woman, she was from Eastern Europe somewhere, terrific. She'd worked at a high level for the UN, various UN agencies in Beirut, and she spoke Arabic. In Bosnia, and she spoke Serbo-Croat, and in Colombia, and she spoke Spanish. And she was writing a dissertation in English. Yeah, I know. I pretended to be very relaxed about this myself. And one of the things that she observed in her working life was what she called islands of peace. So in the middle of these appalling conflicts, and you're at least broadly familiar with most of them. One was urban, Beirut. She found that there was an area of about 3 blocks where all the fighters were kept out. Nobody intruded. It was a little Switzerland, if you like, and there was appalling conflict. And neither side, or in Beirut, none of the sides had any incursions in there. Isn't that curious? Then she worked in Bosnia and she found the same thing at the level of a town. And in Colombia, at a higher geographical, a whole region. And it wasn't an accident. There were activists in these particular arenas who were quite, and somehow managed to, how fascinating, to actually discern a pattern that no one else had discerned. Unfortunately, I didn't get very far with her, and before she was reassigned, and a long tail. But what would the hypothesis look like? My guess with this one is that, like the Iraqi sanctions example, you could be confident that you would get one, but that you would have to read a lot and think about your experience a lot before you could actually get the hypothesis exactly right. You could start out with a crew. You could actually say that even the most protracted violent conflicts do not do not prevent the creation and the maintenance of islands of peace. Something like that. There'd be a second part to it. But her purpose would be in understanding how this happens. It would be a compare and contrast. And so she would have 3 cases rather than 3 themes. She would do Beirut, Bosnia, Colombia in that bottom triangle. Really, really interesting. And sometimes when you've got a really good, rich idea, you've got to keep faith in yourself, and the supervisor will help you. You know, before you get the hypothesis perfectly crafted, you keep moving toward it. And again, both with this example and with the Iraqi sanctions example, you have to read and read and read, because sometimes the themes or the pattern that no one else has discerned before is in there. So you've got to be reading with real discernment, not just, I cracked 5 books today, but I learned a lot. Okay. All right. Oops. Okay, so general research areas, thematic or case study approaches. Well, let's look again at water access policies in rural Zimbabwe. I think that's actually made for a thematic approach. It's an empirical case. And in that top triangle, you would start with water. Just water as a human right and a practical necessity. Water shortages in human rights. You can start at the global level. There's a vast literature on water and water resources. And then you could then go down and say something like, the creation of water infrastructure for large populations. You know, we no longer, most of the world's population now lives in cities. We no longer go down to the stream and hope the water is potable. We turn a faucet. But of course, as soon as you make a water infrastructure for an urban area, or indeed even nowadays for a rural area, politics, money, and say environmental constraints, how much water, for whom, come into play. You saw that last year, or was it earlier this year, with Cape Town. Something we all take for granted, and suddenly we realize environment, politics, law, and commerce all come together. I mean, shall I have a bath once a week so that the wine growers can still maintain their vines? There's a sociology in this too. There are claims on justice. So beneath the crisis, there are lots and lots of themes. So if you were doing this, my bias is toward themes, but I would think, let's talk about politics, commerce, and environmental constraints. That would be one way. Let's look at another. How many of you are in commerce and business? Can you put your hands up? Most. Okay. Let's think. Well, the same thing would apply to, say, spatial planning and solid waste management. You know, I mean, you could do this based on burgeoning cities. Some cities have doubled their population in less than 10 years. Istanbul's one, Kathmandu's another, Mexico City is burgeoning, we've got cities above 10 million. And planning, you know, spatial planning and solid waste management is serious. What are you going to do with that? I mean, if that's your interest, if you're a civil engineer and you're really very interested in that, how would you go about it? Well, start with your heart. What do you care about the most? If you think, I don't want to talk about politics, I'm not interested in that. It matters, but I can abstract it from my dissertation and talk instead about you know, competition for scarce resources in city governments. You can talk about the informal nature of the spread of cities. You know, it's very, very difficult if people are simply building shelters and living in them and without going through planning permission. Cities burgeon like that. You can see it here in South Africa. You can see it especially in Istanbul. Right? So there are practical matters. Start with your heart. You know you're interested in supply chain management. You know you're interested in the impact of online companies on high streets. You're interested in the hotel trade or the restaurant trade. But what in particular? What really seizes you? And from there you can begin this kind of exercise. So I don't have anybody from the humanities here. I thought I'd throw in the humanities, diasporic literatures. Yeah. Okay. So all of these are where you start. Your ideas are more or less at this level. I urge you to let yourself go a little bit. Think about everything you could do. Get a really large piece of paper and splat all over it. Even the stuff you're not interested in, because sometimes it'll give you an idea. Or draw a line down the center of the paper and say, here are the topics, the subtopics. Here are the areas of concentration I can do within my theme. Right? And here are the themes. Politics, law, economics, sociology, environmental constraints, time constraints, all the things that might have a bearing on that. Timely information, adequate infrastructure, the availability of capital if you're in business, the high interest rates suffered by entrepreneurs, whatever you like. Try doing, and you could do 3 columns in fact. You could do sub-themes. You could do cases. You could do themes, and you could do. I've just lost it. If anyone can see the thought bubble over my head, please read it out. But get excited about it. Just have a think and look out. And pretty soon you'll find a lot of the ideas collapse. Some of them might actually combine. It's a really nice creative moment. It's scary, but the way to get over the scary thing is to confront the fear. It's too much. Well, the way you make it less is to write it all down. So start with your theme and think about everything, all the topics that can come under your theme. Think about individual cases and think about abstract things that you could treat thematically. You know, time cost and all this stuff. All right? And do it over and over again. I have a friend in his 60s who worked as an accountant most of his life, and now he's retired and he's determined to become an artist. Scary. It's scary for him. And he doesn't really know quite what he wants to produce. But as a matter of discipline, he goes up to his office every day and works. He goes to work. And he tries, he's a pretty good draftsman. He's a very good photographer. He's got lots of practical skills. You have lots of practical intellectual skills. And he plays until he finds a project in which he can then begin to focus and work. So don't be afraid to play. Don't just play. You need to read. Remember the mantra, read, read, read. I once told a lecture full of undergraduates who were a little bit lazy, you need to read until your eyes bleed. And I heard this little yelp from the back of the hall, and I thought, oh no. I thought, oh, I'm going to get into trouble. Okay, a crude way of putting it. But it won't take you long before you begin to know what it is you most need to read. And even more intriguing, as you begin to work in this way, you begin to learn what you don't know. Every single successful doctoral dissertation that I've worked with a student on, the student has confronted something she doesn't know. A literature or a sub-literature. I'm going to do international sanctions. Actually, I need to read something about international law. Oh my God, international law. Yeah, don't be frightened. You can do this. You know? And some supervisors are very, very prescriptive. I'm going to talk about the supervisory relationship later this week. Some are prescriptive. Some will say, if you want to work closely with me, these are the classicals. You need to read these. So read these and then come back. Okay. Sometimes they'll leave you to it. They want to deal with the ideas, and they'll trust you to find the literature. It depends. I've supervised dissertations where I don't have specific expertise. I didn't know anything about the theory of sanctions when I supervised that. I can supervise a Japanese man on the contribution the theory of conflict resolution makes to Buddhist epistemology. Yeah, true. I didn't know anything about Buddhist epistemology, and I only knew a little bit about the theory of conflict resolution, but I know how to organize a PhD dissertation. That's why these tools, that I'm trying to do, are so powerful, because they work for me too. Okay? All right. So that's what we're going to be doing in those sessions. You know, you're going to come with something that's as big and broad as that, and we're going to think together. We're going to think out loud. And sometimes it's really interesting, really easy. Lots of ideas come out, and sometimes we all get a bit stalled. This kind of thinking's like that. So, in advance, I ask forgiveness if your particular topic stumps me. But I don't need a lot of subject-specific knowledge to see how it could open out. It's only once you get to the level of detail that I get a bit stumped. I could imagine an 8-chapter dissertation about supply chains. It would be an imaginative exercise, but when you start getting down to the detail, that would be focused, right? One of my mantras, God is in the structure, not in the detail. Okay? It's structure, structure, structure. Because once you've got it, you always know where you're putting your foot next. I think in session 8, I'm going to talk about writing your research paper. But when you've got the hypothesis and you've got an 8-chapter, say 8, 9 chapter, the number's not terribly important. Though don't go above 10. Once you begin going below 8,000 words a chapter, it gets bitty. You should be looking at something like 8 to 10,000 words per chapter, on average, because it gives you enough chance to develop. Anyway, what's really good about it is it gives you a great deal of stability. In fact, so much stability that you can actually make changes fairly late in the day. And I'll give you an example. I worked with a lovely man who was looking at the subject. His contention was that the national security policy of a certain U.S. president posed a threat to Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, basically thou shalt not go to war. A real strong contention, very strong contention, and something that he could make a really good argument about. And I actually share this belief. We were at one in that judgment. I thought his hypothesis was actually quite correct. By the time he got to the lower triangle, chapter 5, based on his reading, his thinking, his judgment, he thought, you know what? I don't think that's right. I don't want to express the view that I want to moderate the view. And I said, okay. So we altered his hypothesis slightly. So perhaps not poses a threat, but offers a challenge. And at one point we actually had to reverse the order of two of his chapters for purposes of coherence. We cut it up in 5 minutes. It was easy because the basic structure was sound. And what's true about the 8 chapter titles is true about the bits that come under each of them. I'll talk to you more about that later. So although this is hard, lonely work, and you think, I've been working for 3 months or 4 months or 6 months, and all I've got is a hypothesis, an 8 chapter tentative outline, and a lot of reading under my belt. When am I going to start writing? This is time well spent. It's essential that you get this right at the beginning. And if you do, then you'll be able to move comfortably. If you get this right, get it solid, then, as I said before, it really is like running a marathon. It's one foot after another. Difficult but not complicated. There's nothing complicated about running a marathon. It's just hard work. All right. So this is so that's where we are. So I don't have any more slides for you. I wonder if you would like to go back and look at some of these themes and as a big group begin thinking aloud about how we might go about them. Or for one of you to offer a theme and for us to think about. Shall we try that? I won't wait for somebody to say yes. You took it as a rhetorical question. Very smart. Okay. These or some others. Come on, somebody give me their idea. Somebody give me their research area. Let's play. You'll have an idea about what's going to come tomorrow. Don't worry. You should have seen mine at the beginning. I threw that part of my paperwork away because it was so embarrassed. I thought, I have my PhD now, I don't want to. I mean, it was badly formed. I didn't know what a PhD was. I hadn't crafted a hypothesis. We all start at the same place. Come on, give me your topic. You're not going to make a point at someone, right? Okay, good.
What's the first part?
Migration, where does women go? Susceptible, or basically they're in the line of fire when it comes to structural gender-based violence.
Are they more susceptible?
They're more susceptible.
That the contention is more, okay.
Yeah.
So migrant girls and young women are more susceptible to gender-based violence.
Right away, as soon as I hear that, did everyone hear that? So that migrant girls and young women are more vulnerable to gender-based violence than structural. Okay. The difficulty I have with that right away, as soon as I hear it, is who would be surprised? You know, you'll be able to enlighten me on this, but as soon as I hear it, I think, if you had to make a list of the young women, girls and young women who are most vulnerable to structural GBV, where would you start? The most vulnerable? Street children, for one, probably prostitutes, two, and migrant, and young migrants, because they haven't got the social support networks and the local culture probably don't support them. Is that too obvious to be a hypothesis? It's stated as a hypothesis, which is admirable. I mean, do you actually need to go out and prove that? Suppose I were to say to you, okay, choose a country and look at United Nations Children's Fund or United Nations Development Fund statistics and see whether that's already well known. What are you going to add? Remember, you have to make a contribution to knowledge. It's a fine place to start, and I'm not trying to undermine you. But there's something. There are a good many really, really interesting things you can say about vulnerability to sexual violence with girls and young women, and a lot of things you can say about the vulnerabilities that migrant children, especially young women, have. Is that it?
So would the structural cover like policy influence or not? Or maybe there's
That would depend on how you define it. The question is, would the qualifier structural violence? Maybe you should take GBV out of it. And suppose the hypothesis was migrant girls and young women are more vulnerable than average, if you like, or are particularly vulnerable to structural violence. And suppose you had sexual violence as a theme. Go back to the themes and case studies. You're looking at girls and young women and migrants, and it might be, at the Ugandan border or something, or the border between South Africa and Namibia or Zimbabwe. But suppose you had three themes. She has to define structural violence, and she could say there's sexual violence, there's economic exploitation, which is a form of structural violence, and there's discrimination and social exclusion, say.
yeah.
And I'm not trying to steer you in a direction, but the point is I'm trying to illustrate for everyone else's purposes that immediately I can think of three themes that you could do. Now, if her heart is set on looking at sexual violence, gender-based violence, then that won't work. That's fine. And that's where your heart comes in. You have to do the thing you most want to do. But thank you for the case. I don't want to take it much further because I don't want to keep you in the spotlight. But you've provided me with an opportunity of thinking, ooh, there are thematic possibilities here. Now, of course, you could do it comparatively as well. Yeah, and you could have three different border areas. That's possible. Again, my bias, and do forgive me, is toward the thematic, because it allows simplicity and a richness of detail. Not necessarily. Yes, sir?
My question is it her approach actually correct in terms of your framework, whereby the topic starts at a broad level first, then starts the framework?
Well, she and I, or she, is not quite there yet. Let's talk first about where her heart is, because that's really what I'm approaching you with. If we narrow it down, if she says no, it's going to be about sexual violence. Well, no, but suppose you did, then we could begin talking about, well, have you got a particular area in mind? Have you got particular circumstantial conditions? You know, are they A, homeless? Are they B, in oh, I don't know, migrant accommodation? And C, have they been, are they employed? Something like that. So you could do a kind of vulnerability scale depending on their condition. You could concentrate on one area and do that kinds and degrees of vulnerability as a thematic approach at the bottom. I wouldn't have her write anything out like this, or at least for my purposes at the beginning, but immediately I can begin talking to her and indeed any other PhD student about the possibilities. And of course, if you have this framework in your mind, you immediately know where the themes are going to be. They're going to be in that bottom triangle. Of course they will be. And the question immediately becomes, how do you deliver the reader to your point of focus? So that's where you all start. You all start at the point where the two triangles meet. You know, that's actually where you introduce the topic. You start there. Well, we know right away there's a background literature. You know, there's migration. There's a huge literature on migration, and also about structural violence. A huge literature about gender-based violence. So I know right away. I don't know exactly what that first chapter is going to be about, but I've got a sense of the scale of it because I'm familiar that there are literatures out there. So you can begin to see how you think. You begin to think about these things, and it generates lots of ideas right away. Go on, give me another. Yes, sir.
Mine is a question, but what should someone do if they have chosen or selected grounded theory where a hypothesis is discouraged to explore religion?
Okay. I haven't talked at all about methodology. The question is, what should someone do who's chosen grounded theory? This is a bit of a challenge for me. A, because I'm not familiar with the particulars of grounded theory. I know about it in outline. I don't find it terribly attractive, and here's why. If your dissertation, and I've met a supervisor here who's an expert on grounded theory. One of our staff has supervised 5 students through grounded theory, and grounded theory is inductive rather than inductive. You go out and gather lots of information, and then the themes emerge like groundwater. I have to say that makes me feel very insecure. It's an established methodology. And the reason I feel insecure is not only because it's unfamiliar, but because the risk is it puts too much emphasis on the methodology. You know, what's the subject? You can write a PhD dissertation about methodology, but if that's not your intention, I won't be your supervisor. If that is your intention, I won't be your supervisor. I don't supervise methodological contributions to knowledge. For me, your methodology should be as simple as possible. Methodology answers the question, how? For me, intellectually and creatively, the biggest challenge and the prior challenge is what? So if you're not writing a dissertation about grounded theory, but you're using it to answer the question, I would start with saying, sure, do grounded theory, but about what? What's the methodology for? What are you going to investigate? And that's where this kind of thinking comes in. There's nothing in this, this kind of thinking to stop you doing grounded theory. But if you're going to do a grounded theory approach, make sure you've got a supervisor who is both closely familiar with it and quite willing to take you down that path. For me, at the risk of offending anyone, I find it a kind of exotic methodology. I think it's much safer and much simpler to do a less exotic, more deductive methodology. I hope that answers your question. I rather fear it hasn't, and you're being very polite, for which I thank you. Go on, give me another one. Yes, sir.
My topic is on leadership,
And basically, I want to investigate the role and the impact of followership on second-order organizational change.
You're going to have to unpack that for me. Okay, interested in leadership and followership and impact on second-order organizational change, by which I take it you mean tactical change rather than grand strategic change. So not at corporate headquarters, but within the local office or something like that. Okay. Do you want to know what gives me a rash about that? Followership, leadership and followership. You might, I mean, within the business studies community and the business and commerce community, those terms are probably very, very well defined. But in the end, aren't you talking about management and if you like, initiation? So managers say, we're going to do it this way. And look, I've worked in companies. I have worked in the commercial sector. And I never regarded myself as a follower in the same way I don't regard myself as a sheep, even if you think of yourself as a shepherd. Most employees would say, I'm an employee, I'm not a follower. I don't do followership. You know, I have a reporting relationship with the management, and I am committed to following certain things. Fine, that's your theme. For me, my first question, beyond the clarity about leadership and followership, is okay, but what seems to be the problem? What seems to be the issue? Why would you look at that? There are lots and lots of problems with second-order managerial initiatives, aren't there?
Can I share a bit?
Yeah, please.
So basically, if leadership, according to my understanding, it's basically one can look at it as a process that is co-constructed by leaders and those in hierarchical roles who are basically followers.
Okay.
And the predominant theories or notions out there is that mainly leaders are responsible for the achievement of organizational objectives. And normally they discount the role that people who are following or who are there to do what the leaders are saying are playing a role in this process. And I am basically looking at those people who are contributing towards leadership.
Okay. I think we're very near the boundaries of the so what question. And consider the role of the Vice Chancellor in this university, or the role of the Chief Executive Officer in any large organization. The higher up you go in an organization, you know this already, the more nominal power a chief executive has, but the less effective they are. They actually need the lower levels to initiate the grand strategic plans. Okay. What could be less surprising than that the lower levels of a hierarchical organization are responsible for initiating the plan, but ultimately the leader is accountable. So you've got, if you like, performance responsibility and ultimate accountability. That's not a surprise, is it? I mean, if the chief executive officer says, we're going to reorganize the company and we're going to close down functions A, B, and C, and we're now going to be a service provider instead of a manufacturer, and the company gets into financial trouble 3 years later, it's likely to be not because the people lower down, the people initiating the grand strategic plan failed, but because the grand strategic plan was faulty. You've got an idea, but I want to see. I would want to hear something more specific. What's the puzzle? You know that sometimes grand strategic plans fail. Sometimes leaders are incompetent. Sometimes the followers, if you like, or the middle managers, let's call them, aren't competent. But none of these things are surprising. There's lots and lots of examples. What's the puzzle? Sometimes people perform badly, sometimes people make strategic mistakes. So what? What don't we know about leadership and the initiation of strategic plans at second order corporate levels? What don't we know? What's a puzzle?
Well, I think that sometimes these strategies that companies normally roll out, they fail because the people on the floor, the followers, their heart is not into those things. And sometimes they passively resist, and sometimes they are totally just disengaged. Or they could have other motives, or it could be that perhaps they've got the wrong perception of what is happening at the top.
Look, in my youth, I worked in factories and warehouses, and I can assure you, my heart was never in it. and yet, I didn't drive any of those companies into bankruptcy. Indeed, none of my fellow warehousemen or factory workers, their hearts were in it either. It's hard, tedious work. But we did as we were instructed to do, because we wanted to keep our jobs. You know, that people are half-hearted about their jobs or about a change in their job and don't perform very well. Okay, so what? Big surprise. Happens all the time, doesn't it? You know it happens all the time. You don't have to investigate a corporation to know you're going to find lots of instances of that. What is it about this that you need to investigate? What don't you know? That much we know. Sometimes it fails, and the diagnosis is sometimes because the middle management don't care that much, or they don't like change, or they don't understand the instructions, or they haven't been given the means. Okay, so what? Let me pause there and just take another. But you can see, as a supervisor, I'm not supervising, but in supervisory terms, it's the job to give you a bit of a push. And you feel it, don't you? And the so what isn't meant to be rude. It's meant to say, have you got the investigative character of this? Is there a puzzle that you need to look into? Not just gather information about 2 or 3 corporations. Guess what? Middle management fail because they don't care enough. You know this already, don't you? You know. Yes.
Okay, I'll be brave.
Thank you.
I'll be scapegoat for those who have a broad topic and a lack of focus. So my topic, will tell you immediately it's too broad because the title is Data Privacy in the Cloud. And then I sort of tagged on a little bit of focus where I said legal and regulatory responses to the position of SMEs developing mobile applications. So the heart, if you like, is around the position of SMEs trying to develop mobile apps and being primarily the responsible party for complying with data privacy. But the challenges they face working in this incredibly complex ecosystem where effectively they have to tie by the fact that they need to rely on third parties, app stores, and third party libraries and the big giants of the digital era in terms of SDKs and analytics, etc. So my hypothesis.
Can you define SMEs for us all?
SME would be a small, medium-sized enterprise.
Okay.
Define it.
Yeah, it's all right. Yeah, keep going. So you've got a tentative hypothesis.
Well,
You're
no.
a project.
I worked in it between your first lecture and now. So it's very tentative.
Yeah, sure.
It would be that effective regulation of data privacy in mobile apps must assign responsibility for a privacy by design approach to include third parties who are not currently regulated by our existing legislation.
Boy, that's a mouthful.
It's too much.
Yeah, of course it is. But you know it is. But it's great. It's great because I mean you've got a really large area. You've got lots and lots of possibilities. And if you've had a stab at writing a hypothesis, it's exactly what I want you to do. Your first attempt at this is going to be, well, I mean that's a bowl of spaghetti. But all the spaghetti is nourishing. There's lots and lots of good ideas in there. So you need a bit more clarity. You need to be a bit more succinct. And it's not just about being succinct in expression. It's about being succinct in terms of what it is you want to do. But I can immediately think, ooh, there are thematic possibilities here. Think about that bottom triangle. You've got commercial pressures, which includes app stores, competition from Apple and all the rest of it. You've got inadequate legislation or belated legislation, so you're always at risk of having your development outlawed or over-regulated or made awkward for commercial use. So you've got commercial pressures, you've got legal uncertainties, and maybe perhaps technical challenges or something like that. G5 coming in, and it creates all kinds of other uncertainties. Imagine narrowing down the problem, because you're looking at small medium enterprises, and they are really tightly squeezed, aren't they? Because you've got young independent hackers and what do they call them? Web designers and code developers and all that. You're creating programs and just putting them on an app store. And at the other end, you've got that monster, Apple and Google and all the rest of them. And of course, they're buying up medium and medium-sized enterprises all the time. Anything that looks innovative, they buy up, which means it's squeezed. So your question might be, how do SMMEs mediate the tensions between individual entrepreneurs and large enterprises in the development of new mobile apps? Now that's not a hypothesis, by the way, that's a question, but that would stand. That would stand. You know, it's not strictly speaking necessary to have a hypothesis. You need something that has an investigative character, and a hypothesis is usually the best way to do it. But you see, I mean, and the same is true with your idea. You know, it's quite a rich field, and immediately suggests kinds of possibilities. In the case of your particular example, you need to think a little bit further about what the puzzle is, and that's partly hard work. It's partly what you care about, what really rivets you. Your colleague's idea is perhaps just a little bit more developed. Great possibilities. But think about cases as well. I've just suggested to you three, I mean, off the top of my head, themes. But you could think about cases as well. And, you know, you could actually look at an SMME that was successful. You could look at one that had promise but failed, and you could look at another that's if you like, struggling. You could do cases. I rather like the thematic approach instead. I'm not so sure about that. No, of course not. But keep thinking, and don't get stuck into a groove. My groove is themes, you know, and I tend to bypass case studies. That's a mistake for creative thought. So, like I said, let yourself go a little bit. How are we doing? Time to restart. Okay. Give me another. Yes, sir.
Developing social performance measurement framework for small and medium-scale social enterprises.
Okay, so developing
Social performance measurement framework.
Okay, developing a social. She's interested in developing a social measurement performance framework for small and medium enterprises. Okay. What's the problem there? Why are you attracted to it? there's something about this social frameworks business that's underdeveloped, inappropriate, too narrow, too rigid.
Yeah, the problem here is social enterprises are well known to be a triple bottom line, where they can have an economic, social, and environmental impact to any socio-economic challenges that society is experiencing. So the problem is measuring the financial aspect, which is economical one, is very easy, and lots of tools and techniques has been developed. But when we came to the social value, there is still lack, because one size doesn't fit all in case of the social enterprises, because social enterprise typology is quite different in geographic term, or in terms of their scale, or in terms of the scope, or in terms of the activity in which they are performing throughout the society.
Here's a question for you, and it's a question you could write out for yourself. And are the social measurement metrics for these frameworks, are they quantifiable in a way that's of value to entrepreneurs?
That's the problem in here. You cannot quantify the social impacts where the social enterprise are providing.
Right.
So here, in order to measure their value, my idea is to identify what are the indicators. This is more of a research, the questions that of developing a hypothesis. What are the social performance indicators? What are the indicators? And then looking through the indicators, we can develop the tools from there, and then we can set the framework where any social enterprise by its scale is small and have emission being pure or hybrid or just have a...
Be careful, and this is true especially for those of you in business and enterprise, be careful that you don't approach your topic like a managing director or a business consultant. This is an intellectual business. You know, the job of a doctoral student is not to change the world. Yes, I know it's immensely frustrating, especially for those of you engaged in practical matters like entrepreneurship. But you're looking for an intellectual challenge. I'm not saying that the intellectual puzzle can't have any practical application. Hurrah if it does. But don't be a management consultant only. All right? So, you know, developing the tools is what you would hire a consultant to do.
Yeah.
And you've got a different set of times. Well, you might be a good consultant too, but I want you here because you're intellectual.
That's the reason why I choose the small ones, the small enterprises which have a higher impact in terms of providing a societal problem for the community, doesn't have a power to hire a management consultant to measure what they're really performing towards the society. They don't have that power. That's where I came in. They can have that framework, and they can answer the accountability and the transparency they are expected to have for the investment communities. Because whenever you speak with the social enterprises and social entrepreneurs in South Africa, they would say the main challenge they are experiencing is lack of funding.
Sure.
Yeah,
of course.
lack of funding, and they're not sustainable because usually they don't have a legal framework to ask, and then they don't see they don't clearly know from whom they are expected to acquire funds to be sustainable.
You've got a huge advantage because you know the field. Clearly you've worked in the field. That's an advantage, and it has its drawbacks as well, because you can get a little bit close to it. I would have you pull back a little. You've got friends and colleagues, and you'd really like to be able to help them, wouldn't you? Of course you would. You can be forgiven for that, but you need to step back a little bit further. What's the puzzle? What is it you have to investigate? Don't tell me what you already know. Tell me what it is that you and those of you doing commerce and business and those of us interested in development more generally need to know about this. Right? Just let me pause you there. Has anybody got any questions? Yes, sir.
So the more you do not know is the good side.
Well, it's an inevitability. You know, you can't. Don't pretend. Don't pretend. I've already confessed. I started precisely where you are. You already know a lot. You've got at least one and very probably 2 degrees behind you, and most of you've got professional experience of one sort or another as well. You know, and if I thought you weren't intellectuals, I wouldn't take you on. You know, so you've got a lot of power, but you haven't got a lot of knowledge yet, and the knowledge that you have isn't configured in a way that will necessarily make you a dissertation, which is why I keep talking about structure. You know, I mean, every strength has a flip side, has a weakness. Like the professional experience can sometimes get you a bit close, can narrow your focus. Some people come in and they've been working in a rural village in Zimbabwe for 3 years, and it's got to be about rural villages in Zimbabwe. Well, maybe not. You know, lift your heads. But don't be embarrassed. You know, there's always an appropriate humility. And any PhD supervisor who tells you that he's never learned anything from the students isn't telling you the truth. You know? I mean, the compass of my ignorance is a constant source of embarrassment to me. There's so much I don't know, even about the fields in which I have expertise. We're always ready to catch up. Okay, you know, be humble, but then do the work. Don't be frightened, really. And that applies to all of you. You can do this, and you will. Okay, tomorrow at 9. Okay, and we'll go from 9 to about 10, and then at 11 I've got my first session. I don't know what room yet, but we'll work that out. And we'll do more of this